The best place to hide the truth is in the pages of a book.
Maybe we should just read. Maybe we should just read.
Welcome to Hayes Reviews. Hello and good evening. Nick here, broadcasting to you from England. I am the creator of the channel Hayes Reviews, and we are here for another live stream book reading session. Good evening and welcome to you all tuning in live, and hello to you all watching on the replay as well. If you are watching on the replay at some time in the future, I hope you're having a wonderful day, and you can take advantage of the pinned comments underneath the video, which contains timestamps that you can use to jump right ahead to the good stuff if you just want to get to the readings tonight. But I wouldn't advise skipping over tonight's introduction because I've got a few good things to get into and even a song for everyone to listen to. No, it's not a song of mine. It's not me singing. I wouldn't put you through that auditory ordeal. I think me talking is enough for your precious ears. But we do have a song on tonight's preamble ramble, a couple of Wikipedia pages to look at before we get into the reading tonight. This is part 10 of our series of videos reading G. Edward Griffin's book, The Fearful Master. Now, we're not only reading that book. When I purchased my copy of that book, it came with a bundle of goodies, leaflets and pamphlets and other articles and contextual things that came out around the same time the book was published, which flesh out the picture and the evidence which G. Edward Griffin was marshalling in that book to support his thesis that the United Nations may not be what it is pretending to be, what we are led to believe it is, what we might assume that it is. Okay, the UN has a history. And it hasn't been there forever. It is not this godlike, eternal organization that has always existed and stands only for the good and the true and the beautiful and justice and fairness and all these kinds of things. The UN has a history. Men got together and they came up with a plan, and then they took some actions and they brought that plan into reality. And now we are living through that plan. This organization has been set up and it impacts our lives on a day-to-day basis. If you are not aware of that fact, don't you think you should be? Wouldn't you want to know if there was some supranational organization out there making plans that affect everything you get to do in this world? Well, there is, and it's called the UN. And G. Edward Griffin, 60 years ago, wrote this book, The Fearful Master, and it's subtitled A Second Look at the United Nations. And now we have actually completed the book. We've read through the whole thing. There's 3 parts to it, and it was quite a roller coaster. It was powerful. It has a lot of detailed testimony from people who experienced the UN's aggressive policies firsthand. It's got many quotes from a variety of sources, mainly people who are allied with the UN and are sympathetic to its goals and even work for it. The book was quite a punchy, short, sharp read. We got through it in 7 videos, I think. And then for part 8 and part 9, we've been going through some of the extra material, reading some of the articles. And the main event, though, is this document here, which I'll hold up for you right now. And that's the 46 Angry Men, the UNO Violations in Katanga. This document was written by 46 doctors who worked in Elizabethville and they wanted to bring to the world leaders' attention these violations of the United Organization, as it was then known. It was the UNO, the UNO, the number one, the one world order, the one world government, perhaps. But it was known as the UNO, the United Nations Organizations. And according to these doctors, the UNO forces who were deployed in Katanga, which is a county in the Congo, were guilty of violations of the UN Charter, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and of the Geneva Conventions. And this is quite a powerful testimony to these forces that went in and committed horrific acts of barbarity. It has not been easy reading, but it really serves to hammer home what G. Edward Griffin wrote about in the first part of the book, where he chronicled the events that took place in Katanga. He referred to this as a case study in what the UN is really all about, the kind of people who it supports, the kind of people who its troops attack and abuse and murder indiscriminately, and rape and even pillage. So raping and pillaging going on. You don't usually associate those things with the UN, but historically, those things happened by forces who were wearing the UNO, I suppose, regalia at the time. And so we're going to continue tonight with that 46 Angry Men document. We're going to finish that off. We've got the last third of it to read. It's quite sobering to read these anecdotes and these stories. They are very upsetting and quite hard listening for people who might be sensitive to accounts of violence. A sort of trigger warning is worth mentioning up front, I think, because there's some gruesome pictures in there and gruesome details about the wounds and the mortal wounds in many cases. But I think we've got through the worst parts of it, because the murders were up front in the book, and a long list of people who were just indiscriminately murdered by UN forces, largely Ethiopian forces. But also there were Irish and Swedish, I think, in there as well, who were also guilty of doing similar things. But we've made it through the section where they list the murders. We've made it through the section where they list all the injuries. We're on now, I think, let me just look. We've got coming up bombardment of hospitals. So this is the instances in which the Red Cross ambulances and buildings were targeted on purpose. So just being there and volunteering and trying to do a good thing and putting yourself in harm's way in order to help alleviate the suffering of some fellow human beings, that was considered a target. And many buildings had red crosses, large red crosses painted on them to signify the people living in there were there to help and were not combatants, not engaged in any kind of political or military organization. They were there for other purposes out of the goodness of their hearts, because they want to alleviate some of the suffering being caused, some of the suffering happening in that part of the world, in the Congo, and they were targeted. It's sobering, grim stuff and grim reading, but we got to get through it. I think, as I've said in a previous video, we kind of owe it to the memory of the people who suffered there, the memory of the people who went down. We owe it to get their story on the record, encapsulated on this channel in these videos, for people to come back and read it in the future, because this document is not widely available. I'm not sure if there's an electronic copy online. I haven't looked, to be honest. It might be out there. So you might be able to find an electronic copy online. There are not many physical copies for sale. The ones that I did see for sale were in the sort of 60, 70, 80 pounds, dollar type bracket. And so quite pricey for a document that is, let's see, it's about 90 pages long. But it's a historical artifact that I think has been occulted and hidden and is not talked about very often. And it's certainly a piece of history that I was totally ignorant of until I read this book, till I took some time to share this with you, the viewing audience out there, the listening audience, and to learn from G. Edward Griffin, to humble myself to the position of learner, to admit I don't know it all, I don't have it all figured out, and I shouldn't assume anything about any of these groups that exist, the supranational groups, the international groups, the political groups. We shouldn't assume anything. For example, we read through the Fabian Freeway on this channel. That was an epic book. I think one of the favorites of the audience. I get good feedback on that one. I get people telling me that they would recommend, if you're new to the channel and you want to start somewhere, go to the Fabian Freeway playlist on the playlist tab on Rumble, Odyssey, and YouTube, and start there, because that book is incredibly eye-opening. And from that book, I learned some amazing things about the origin of the British Labour Party, the party which is currently in control of the country, which is currently stoking all kinds of divisive situations, playing groups off against each other, making things incredibly expensive, not taking care of those who need opportunities, need comfort, need warmth, need food in many cases. It's getting tough for people here. And when you look into the origins of the British Labour Party, you kind of start to learn about why that might be, why it might not be accidental, why it might actually be part of a long-term plan, an agenda that was put into motion over 100 years ago with a group who met together in 1884 and decided they were going to change the world slowly, gradually, like a tortoise, just marching on, doing a little bit every single day, never giving up, never stopping. Everyone sort of says, it's just a tortoise going about its business, nothing to worry about here. But then 100 years later, you find out, wow, things have really gone according to their plans. And when you read their books and learn about their intentions, the worldview that they had, the opinions they had of poor people, of sick people, of people who had maybe lower intellectual ability or lower physical ability, they had a very harsh outlook. They had a very self-centered outlook. They wanted to get rid of certain classes and groups of people, and they wanted to preserve the wealth, power, and influence of their own class. And they've put plans into motion, and they've been diligently working away at those plans. And part of that plan involved the founding and the creation of the Labour Party, and they are still working with the Labour Party to this very day. In fact, a good proportion of people who got into Parliament in this most recent round of selections are open Fabian Society members. So don't assume anything about these groups, these whether political or international or supranational. Don't assume they're there for the benefit of you and your loved ones and your friends and your family and your colleagues. Right? Look into them. Find out some information, historical information about the founding and the origin and the outlook, the goals and the aims back in the day, because these goals and plans tend to go on, but they get rebranded and they get different names added to them, and they're described in different terminology, and that's how they're hidden and occulted from the awareness of everyday people who just sort of assume that, well, they're probably good and we should probably do what they say, because they're putting all this effort into convincing us that they really care about us. So, but anyway. That's my little introduction spiel. I've got a few things to get through before we go into the reading, so I'm going to jump over to the article Cam. I don't think I've got anything else to say, so we'll jump over to the article Cam, and I'll tell you this first bit. So here we have got a YouTube video, and there's a reason that I'm sharing this with you. This is the audiobook of Animal Farm, and it's on a channel called Doses of English. And I've been listening to this the last couple of days, and I wanted to tell people the reason I'm sharing this is because I'm going to be talking very soon with Melissa of the Cutting Through the Matrix YouTube channel, and the channel exists in other places, and there's cuttingthroughthematrix.com, the website, and a variety of other websites on which is immortalized the fantastic work of Alan Watt, a researcher, a book reader, a thinker, a kind of truth-seeking, truth-telling wizard of spoken word who made all these, I don't know, probably thousands of hours of audio lectures or blurbs, as he referred to them, trying to help people see the bigger picture. When you stand back and you see these machinations and you start to realize that things aren't quite what we're being told, and you start to want to learn, okay, what is actually going on here? Alan Watt provided dearth of materials that there's so much there. I'm not sure if dearth is the right word. I think I messed up on that word. I think that's totally the wrong word to use in that context. But I'm going to be talking to Melissa, who runs his channels and uploads his speeches and adds her own content as well in amongst those blurb, those educational talks. And I'm going to be talking to her about this book, Animal Farm, which until this week I'd never read, believe it or not. For a guy who reads books online for a living, I'd never read Animal Farm, but now I have, and I wanted to put this excellent audiobook onto people's radar. You can see it's 3 hours long, and you can also see that I've marked a little clip here. I've put a timestamp on that I'm going to share with you now. So if you're not familiar with the book, it's fantastic. You've got no excuse to not be familiar with it now that I've given you, made you aware of this particular video. But I'm just going to play to you one of the reasons why this audiobook is so good, because the gentleman reading it, he does all the voices and he even sings the song as well, which is called Beasts of England. And this is the song, this is the anthem which rouses the animals and makes them become so inspired that they want to overthrow their master, the farmer, kick him off the farm and run the farm, take it back for themselves, so they're not being exploited and they're not living under slavery anymore. And this is the song that unites all the animals and really gets them fired up to do that. And I think in this audio, he did an excellent job. So I'm just going to play that for those who have never heard the song before, the lyrics, just to, I don't know, just give a bit of a shout out to this excellent video and audio. So let's go for that now. Hopefully you can hear it.
Beasts of England, beasts of Ireland, beasts of every land and clime, hearken to my joyful tidings of the golden future time. Soon or late the day is coming, tyrant man shall be o'erthrown, and the fruitful fields of England shall be trod by beasts alone. Rings shall vanish from our noses, and the harness from our back. Bit and spur shall rust forever, cruel whips no more shall crack. Riches more than mind can picture, wheat and barley, oats and hay, clover beans and mangel wurzels shall be ours upon that day. Bright will shine the fields of England, purer shall its waters be, sweeter yet shall blow its breezes on the day that sets us free. For that day we all must labour, though we die before it break. Cows and horses, geese and turkeys, all must toil for freedom's sake. Beasts of England, beasts of Ireland, beasts of every land and clime, hearken well and spread my tidings of the golden future time. The singing of this song threw the animals into the wildest excitement. Almost before Major had reached the end, they had begun singing it for themselves. Even the stupidest of them had already picked up the tune and a few of the words, and as for the clever ones, such as the pigs and dogs, they had the entire song by heart within a few minutes.
All right, I'll leave it there. It's just a little clip to give you a teaser and a taster, and just to remind you that that video is going to be coming soon, and I'm sure that's going to be a very interesting conversation, because what a powerful book. Very simple. It's a fairy tale. George Orwell says it's a fairy tale, but it has got so much insight into how things work, how revolutions are fomented and carried out, and what actually happens when you buy into this kind of ideology. Okay, so it ties in very nicely with our reading of Fabian Freeway. It ties in excellently with G. Edward Griffin's insights into the origins of the UN as detailed in The Fearful Master. So I'm very much looking forward to having that conversation with Melissa. I don't know when it's going to be uploaded, but sometime in the next week or two, I would imagine. And just to let you know, that's Alan Watt CTTM. This is the YouTube channel where Melissa posts her reduxes. She does these real history episodes. This is our conversation is going to be a real history episode, but there's the redux videos of Alan Watt, speeches, all sorts of stuff on there. Plenty of stuff to chew through. 272 videos, and it is all very good. But her, you got to remember to visit the channel because the notifications have been disabled. You're not allowed to receive notifications for this channel. It's the only time I've seen this on YouTube where you are not allowed to have any. All you're allowed to do is unsubscribe. It's been disabled. I don't know if that's. I guess it's not Melissa who's done that. I don't know why she would do that. So maybe it is. Maybe that's something you can choose to do if you run a channel. I don't know. But yeah, you're not allowed to have notifications for this. You've just got to remember to go there. But videos get put up all the time. 1 day ago, 3 days ago, 5, 8. So there's new stuff going on. Some excellent conversations with some very interesting people. One of the highlights was an episode with, I think I saw it on here earlier, Dr. Sean Cross. That was a very interesting episode. He's got a lot of fascinating things to say. So, Alan Watt CTTM. I would really recommend people have a look there. And I'm going to be on there pretty soon too, which is going to be an honor and a privilege, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Okay. And this is, apologies, I just moved forward. This is Alan Watt's website where you can check out his books. You can go through the archive of free audio, free video. There's a free podcast. The new stuff that Melissa puts up still gets posted here as well. So that's another place where you can go. I would definitely recommend checking out Blurbs, these educational talks. If you go here, you can see all the dates at the top there. There's a lot to get through, and I still haven't listened to all of these. I tried to go back to the oldest ones and just work my way through, but there's interviews. There's just a wealth of material. So stuff to get your teeth into, and I guarantee you will learn things for sure. Okay, so because this is going to be the last video in this series, talking about the UN and G. Edward Griffin and the Fearful Master and the documents that came with it, I wanted to give a little preview of what's coming up next. So if I go back to the headcam, when we did a vote on the last round of books to read on the channel, we did that vote in the Telegram group, and we had a good turnout there. We voted on 3 books, and instead of just reading the most popular one, I decided to do all 3. The first one was the first one was Fabian Freeway, which we've done. Second one was Fearful Master, done. The third one was the Milner-Fabian Conspiracy: How an International Elite is Taking Over and Destroying Europe, America, and the World. It's quite a long book. I've been flicking through it and reading a little bit today. It's extremely well referenced. There is all manner of book recommendations in the bibliography and the footnotes. So that is going to be a fantastic read. And so I wanted to show people one of the reasons why you might want to keep an eye out for this series, and maybe tell other people and let them know about it as well, is if we go back to the article cam over here. If you go on bookfinder.com, which is where I search for books that if I want to find, it does an aggregate search of lots of different websites all at once. And so it's a good place to get the lowest prices for books when you're trying to find a new one to add to your collection. So I go here all the time, and I type in the Milner-Fabian Conspiracy, and it comes up with two options. There's a new copy and used copies. Then that's not a lot really, but let's see what Bookfinder can turn up for us. So on this page, you can buy it on eBay in the United States. It's going to set you back £85, however. Not sure what that is in dollars, but I think it's more in dollars. It might be $95 or something. So a brand new copy of the book, you're looking at £85. Funnily, strangely, the used books are more expensive. You're looking at £88 all the way up to £386. Okay? So this is a hard to find book. It's not easy to track down affordable copies. That's quite a bit of money to lay out for a softcover book that was published in 2012 by an author who I don't really know anything about. I can't find any information about the author. And if we go to the second page of results that we got, there's just one copy of it here in the United States, £211. So this book's not cheap, and it's not plentiful and easy to find and out there. I don't know if anyone else has read through it in full the way I'm doing, but you can see that it's kind of occulted. When books are this expensive and this rare, I tend to assume that's because there's probably something very important between those pages that I want to know about and I want to learn. So that's just to sort of point out to people that this one might be one to tune into and one not to miss. You can see on here it's 525 pages. It's quite a whopper of a book, so it's going to take us a while to chew through it. But the bits that I've read, I've just thumbed through it and picked out pages at random. The bits that I've read tie in incredibly well with the stuff we've already done on this channel. With H.G. Wells' Open Conspiracy, it ties in really well with Fabian Freeway, with The Fearful Master, but also Bertrand Russell has Man of Future. We did Rothschild's Ignatius Boller as well. This book is really tying a lot of that stuff together in one place. So, and it's going to continue the story, continue the work and the research of Rose Martin and Carol Quigley. So he's sort of making the case that since the 1960s, when Tragedy and Hope and Fabian Freeway were published, he's charting what's happened since then between the 1960s and 2012 and capturing all that. And so I think it's going to be a really eye-opening and powerful book to read, and just would let people know that once today's video wraps, that's the one we're going to be reading next. But we're not going to be reading it until I've moved house, which is what I'm going to be largely focusing on for the month of September. So there's going to be a little bit of a delay there before we get on with that book. But that's on its way, and that is going to happen, probably starting late September, early October, I would imagine. So allmylinks.com/Hayes Reviews. If you feel inclined at any point to either support the work that I'm doing here or find other ways to stay connected with me, you got my YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey links. We got Entropy as well, which I always forget to mention, but Entropy is a good place to get free speech content and also to make super chats if you are inclined to do so. Then I've also got a Telegram group, an Instagram page, and a Twitter, Twixter page where I post various things. I retweet some things on Twitter, but I tend to post on these three when I'm going to be broadcasting live, so you can stay in contact and make sure you are here for future broadcasts there by joining those pages. And we got some crypto donation wallets as well if you fancy sending over some crypto. I will not turn that down at all. I think that might bring us to the end. Oh no, okay. So that brings us to the readings of today that I've picked and what we are going to look into. Let me just check this is good. So we've got two things to read through tonight before we finish off 46 Angry Men. It's quite a bit of reading that we're going to do, but it's the last video of the series, so let's get a good bit done, right? The first thing we're going to read is from the Congressional Record. So one of the documents that came along with my copy of The Fearful Master was congressional comments on the UN. Ed Griffin in the book points out that we tend to always hear about the praise and the people who are aligned to and support the UN, and they want to further its aims and give it the praise and adulation and glorification that our children are trained to give it in the schooling. But there's a whole bunch of American politicians who spoke out against it and criticized it. And I'm sure there are in other countries as well. But these people tend to get sidelined. They tend to be called names. They get their reputations tarnished, and they probably get held back in their careers. I would have thought fewer doors are opening in terms of opportunities and ways to progress and move up the ladder for the people who speak out against these kinds of big international agendas that think tanks and globalists are trying to roll out, okay, using mechanisms such as the UN and the League of Nations before that. So what this document has is a bunch of comments on the UN from the Congressional Record. So I thought let's have a look and see what is the Congressional Record. I know that in America you have Congress, but I thought for people who don't know that, Congress, what's the record? Well, it tells us here it's the official record of the proceedings and debates of the United States Congress, published by the United States Government Publishing Office and issued when Congress is in session. The Congressional Record Index is updated daily online and published monthly. At the end of a session of Congress, the daily editions are compiled in bound volumes constituting the permanent edition. So this is the official United States government record of what is talked about and discussed and debated behind those closed doors. It's good that they keep a record of this so that we can go back and see how topics were dealt with in the past and have that window into history that we otherwise might not get. And I often mention that books written back in before the internet, these are the kind of records that people and authors would have to dig through and spend many, many hours painstakingly reading over and looking at to try and piece together what's going on and find those quotes that give an insight into the story as it unfolded rather than the story as it is presented to us by the propagandists who write the textbooks that are taught to our children in their schooling, right? So the Congressional Record, the first thing we're going to read tonight is some quotes. There's a lot here, actually. This booklet has very small text, and it has a number of references from various Congressional Record entries. So we're not going to go through all of them, but we'll have a look at some of them. So that's the first thing we're going to read tonight. Then after that, we're going to have a look at, let me scroll to the top here. We're going to have a look at an article written by Gary Allen. Gary Allen, who is he? Well, I knew about Gary Allen. I knew he was an author. And I have a couple of books of his, right? I have one called None Dare Call It Conspiracy. I have another one about the Rockefellers. I have another one about Kissinger. So he was on my radar as the writer of these sort of conspiracy books, but giving an insight into some of the American side of things, as you can imagine, with the Rockefellers, the Kissinger title of the books. None Dare Call It Conspiracy. I showed, I don't know where it is. It's not in its place on the shelf. I might have packed it already. I showed that on the previous stream. It's a really short book. It's very thin, and it's a very good primer. It's a good place to start. Don't take every word for granted in there, but it gives you a big picture, an introduction to the big picture with names and events and the sequence of what happened that you can then look into with further, deeper research. So it's a good starting point. It's a nice thing to get someone who's just getting into these kind of topics and these things, right? But the next article we're going to read is by Gary Allen. Who was he? Well, he was an American conservative writer. He promoted the notion that international banking and politics control domestic decisions, taking them out of elected officials' hands. So he is promoting an idea that the people you elect are not the people in control. There's unelected people in control, pulling the strings, making decisions, and these are domestic decisions that you should be involved in, that your elected officials should be making on your behalf, right? Because that's why we elect them in the first place, to represent us and our interests. He's saying, no. The power lies elsewhere. The decisions are made somewhere else. And it is not the people you're voting for who are actually in control. So it's quite a controversial stance to take. It's the kind of stance and opinion you might get you labeled as a conspiracy theorist. And I'm sure this guy put up with a lot of that during his lifetime, which unfortunately was only 50 years. So quite, short life. Considering. But a little background on him: he studied history at Stanford University. So that's a pretty respectable university, right? And a quite a topic that you would expect. You would have some, it's not like he went there to study, I don't know, media studies or something. And no disrespect to anyone studying media studies, but what is it really? Watching TV? I mean, no, it's history. It's been a very important, respected discipline for a long time. And I think for those of us who err toward the side of conspiracy, what we tend to find is we become that way when we start learning about history. We start to go, oh my goodness, that happened? They did that? And you realize that there's a lot of conspiracy that is proven and verifiable and not controversial in the historical record. There's a lot of conspiracy in the historical record that is hidden and occulted, de-emphasized, and left off our menus when we go to school and university. But I think it's taking an interest in history that makes many of us start to want to learn about these things, because the historical record is where you learn about the real machinations and levels of power and how the world really works, right? Interestingly, he was a prominent member of the John Birch Society, who, if I think I'm correct in saying, Ed Griffin was a member of this society as well. He was also a speechwriter for a governor. So pretty well credentialed, pretty respectable roles that he's holding. He's been to Stanford University, studied history. He's not just some crackpot lunatic who, I don't know, had a Kundalini awakening on a mountain in Peru and then went on national television and called himself Jesus, for example, just to compare him to another well-known researcher and writer. But anyway, he in his writing, he co-wrote a book titled None Dare Call It Conspiracy. That's kind of the famous one. And in that book, Allen and his co-author assert that the modern political and economic systems in most developed nations are the result of a sweeping conspiracy by the establishment's power elite, for which he also uses the term insiders. According to the authors, these insiders use elements of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. Okay, so this is starting to tie into the Fabian Freeway and the Fearful Master, the communist origins of the United Nations, and the Fabian Society's slow, gradual transformation of free market, capitalist, private ownership, Christian culture into one of socialism, atheistic, scientific, top-down, technocratic control, right? The four elements mentioned by Allen and Abraham in this book are: one, to establish an income tax system. The color's not very good, is it? Let me change that to pink. Establish an income tax system as a means of extorting money from the common man. Well, that's been done, obviously. We all have to pay our income tax, otherwise we get put in a box, a prison, a cage. Establish a central bank, deceptively named, so that people will think it's part of the government. Okay, so that's your Federal Reserve and your Bank of England. Of course, it's just part of the government. We elect the government, therefore we are in control of the bank, right? Have this bank be the holder of the national debt. Well, I think in this day and age, the central bank does hold the national debt, but other countries also can buy that debt, can't they, and hold it too. So that bit might be a little bit dated. And then run the national debt and the interest thereon sky high through wars, starting with World War I. So I think this is pretty much on the money, exactly what happens and what goes on, and is provable. So worth considering that these were all elements of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. And he quotes the Council on Foreign Relations as stating, the US must strive to build a new international order. And of course, we've probably all seen the clips of these politicians standing up on stage talking about a new world order and all the different examples from England, from America, just saying it out in the open brazenly and with confidence and no sign of shame or embarrassment or secrecy. That's because it's the open conspiracy, as H.G. Wells wrote about in his book, which we also read on this channel. So in the section of Gary Allen's articles, you can find a copy here of the one we're going to read tonight, which is this one, Get Us Out, the UN Threatens the United States. It was published in American Opinion, January 1972. And if you click that, it'll take you to an electronic PDF of the one that we're going to look at today. So you can grab a copy of that. There's also one here about Rockefeller campaigning for the New World Order. I haven't read that, but I just highlighted it because we read the story of the Rockefeller Foundation on this channel, so that ties in as well. And when it comes to books, he's got None Dare Call It Conspiracy with Larry H. Abraham. So these are linked, and you can view None Dare Call It Conspiracy. There's the front cover there. It's a really good front cover, in fact. I like it a lot. But, you can't read it because you have to log in and borrow the electronic book. You have to borrow pixels, and you have to renew it every hour pending availability. So you can buy this. If you wanted to read it, you can buy this from Amazon or wherever, really. It's pretty easy to get hold of. Now, these other two books I have, Kissinger, The Secret Side of the Secretary of State, and I also have a copy of this, The Rockefeller File. They're a bit harder to find, but you can get them. Interestingly, when I clicked those links, we got this message, item not available. The item is not available due to issues with the item's content. So a nice, specific, and reasonable, sensible excuse as to why we can't look at this particular arrangement of ones and zeros and digital information. It's just not available because issues. Now go away and stop trying to learn about Kissinger and the Rockefellers. Fear not, I have physical copies of these books. We can read them on the channel. They're pretty short. I reckon we'll get through them pretty quick. And here's the electronic copy of what we're going to read today, which is Gary Allen's Get Us Out. And that is what we are going to read right now, in fact. So that brings us to tonight's reading. So I'm just going to move a few things around, and then we'll go over to the book cam and crack on with that. Any of those links that you would like, please let me know. I can chuck them in the chat for you, but they're all easy to find. All standard available sources, YouTube, Wikipedia. And for now, we still have access to those things. So as I mentioned, this is going to be my last live stream from here, from sitting at this desk in this room with this particular arrangement of books and shelves behind me. I'm going to have to pack all this up. I've already started packing all this up. Believe it or not, I've already packed 8 boxes of books. So, and this lot over here, you know, I think looks pretty much the same. There's a few gone from those shelves, but I've already packed 8 boxes of books, and I've still got all those behind me to do. But we're getting there, and I think we're not moving too far, so we can take our time and do it in little bits. So, but this is the last broadcast from here today. And the next time you see me, we're going to be in a slightly different setup, different kind of arrangement. Hopefully it'll look good, sound good, and be just as good as this. But I'm hoping in the intervening time that I have off to do a little sort of revamp and upgrade to the broadcast and the way we do these. So do not dismay. The other thing I'm going to do as well is keep creating some clips and uploading them to YouTube and Instagram. So there's still some stuff going out there, and Telegram as well. So there'll be chunks of these live streams clipped down into bite-sized pieces that don't scare people off who don't have long attention spans. So before we get into the reading, we have got Frank in the chat. We got Christopher and LJ. Good evening. You are the early starters tonight, and then Johnny and Auntie Coviet here as well. Good to see you all. I'm very happy. And we got Heidi over on Rumble. Lovely jubbly. LJ is asking, is David Icke still putting stuff out? He is. He's got a new book coming out. It's called The Reveal, and it is about how we all get stuck in this cycle of reincarnation and how to escape it. I've got a couple of Icke books, and he does put a lot of good information in them, to be fair, but he doesn't back it up with any evidence. So you're kind of there's threads to pull on, but it's not well referenced, well researched academic type stuff. Not like Ed Griffin with all the footnotes and the signposts to other books of where he got his information. David Icke doesn't do that. He just stream of conscious, massive books, 500, 600 pages, all this information, data dump, and you have to then go to work sorting the wheat from the chaff, figuring out what is real and what is embellished and added. And so I wouldn't recommend people read David Icke, although I found the books that I have read of his to be extremely engaging and entertaining, because you kind of read it in his voice, and he puts in these little phrases and sort of reactions to things like, yeah, right, mate, you want us to believe that? Whatever, mate, you know. And so he writes it in the way that you can imagine him speaking in interviews and on his videos. So it is good, but I'd have to put it in the conspiratainment category, you know, and not in the actual and factual historical research category. Good evening, Elizabeth. Just rolled in as well. Lovely to have you here. You're just in time for the reading. And Frank says, best of luck with the house move. I've done it 3 times. A lot of work. Yeah, I've done it 3 times already as well. But it's never been a house. We're actually moving into a house. I've only ever lived in shared houses and flats. So we're actually moving we're actually moving flat, and we're just moving our flat into a house. So it shouldn't be too stressful, but never say never, right? All right then. Let's power up the book cam. Get it over here and see how it's looking. That's not too bad. So this is published by American Opinion, which I think was a magazine. I don't know if they only printed I think they had a magazine, and these are reprints of specific articles from the magazine. So this isn't the whole article. And that's why it says reprint at the bottom there. All right, American opinion. Get Us Out. The UN Threatens the United States by Gary Allen. Get Us Out. Gary Allen, a graduate of Stanford University and one of the nation's top authorities on civil turmoil and the New Left, is author of Communist Revolution in the Streets and of the explosive bestseller Richard Nixon, The Man Behind the Mask, just released by Western Islands. Mr. Allen, a former instructor of both history and English, is active in anti-communist and other humanitarian causes. I like how the anti-communist cause is grouped as is classed as a humanitarian cause. Humanitarian cause, sorry. It is really, isn't it? To be anti, but I think anti-communist or anti-communitarian or anti-collectivist. That's an important thing as well. And anti-Coviet, obviously, the humanitarian cause of being anti-Coviet and anti-collectivist. Gary Allen, now a film writer, author, and journalist, he is a contributing editor to American Opinion. Gary Allen is also nationally celebrated as a lecturer. All right, let's get into the article. On October the 25th, 1971, the United States of America suffered a severe kick in the teeth when the United Nations General Assembly voted 76-35 to oust the legal government of China and replace it with representatives of Mao Zedong. The New York Times reported that after the voting, for long minutes, the packed hall rang with applause and cheers for the winners. There was rhythmic clapping. The word gleeful was generally used to describe those who had voted to oust the peaceful government of America's staunchest ally, Chiang Kai-shek, and seat in his place the world's premier warmongers. Symbolically and appropriately, the delegate from communist Tanzania danced the Watusi when the results of the vote were announced. Our ambassador to the United Nations, George Bush, and I guess that's George Bush Sr., maintained that we had seen the hatred of America as it really exists in the United Nations. The mood of the General Assembly that night was ugly. It was something harsh, said Bush, noting that he had been roundly hissed as he rose to speak. Walter Troen of the Chicago Tribune observed, quote, "The expulsion of nationalist China demonstrated clearly, if further demonstration were necessary, that we have few, if any, friends anywhere. Those nations we saved in World War II and those nations we helped on their feet after the war voted against the retention of nationalist China in the UN. Even nations whose very creation we supported and financed joined in the chorus of anti-Americanism. 4 of the 6 common market nations voted against us: Belgium, France, the Netherlands, and Italy. Of the other 2, West Germany is not a UN member and Luxembourg bravely abstained. Also voting against us in this important test were our NATO allies Britain, Canada, Iceland, Portugal, Turkey, Norway, and Denmark. As high officials in the Nixon administration have maneuvered to blame the defeat on assorted Ethiopians in the fuel supply, it has become more and more obvious that the vote was fixed from the start. One remembers that according to Human Events for September the 25th, 1971, quote, President Nixon handed Peking a handsome gift last week, making his offering only 5 days prior to the opening of the General Assembly of the United Nations. In his extemporaneous press conference, the president announced a fresh sellout Taiwan doctrine, stressed that the United States would not only welcome Peking into the UN, but that we also wanted it to sit on the all-important Security Council. He further demonstrated that the US favored the eviction of Taiwan from the Security Council, this without Red China having relinquished a single concession to the US. Mr. Nixon had already greased the skids with his announcement that he would journey to Peking to pay homage to the Oriental despot Mao Zedong. But, for the sake of appearances, Ambassador Bush made a clumsy effort to resist the Albanian resolution to oust the nationalist government. And while Mr. Bush was pushing one policy for the television cameras, the real Nixon policy was being spelled out privately. As the New York Times reported October the 26th, 1971, the president was, quote, flashing one political signal while the United States seemed to be pursuing another in the United Nations. The next day, in the Los Angeles Times, the syndicated liberal columnist Robert Elegant observed, quote, the long arm of coincidence can stretch only so far. It was hardly coincidence that placed Dr. Henry Kissinger, the president's guru for foreign affairs, in Peking at the precise moment the United Nations was voting to admit Communist China and expel Taiwan. The adroit orchestration of Kissinger's visit, American maneuverings at the United Nations, and Peking's ritual denunciation of that maneuvering revealed a high level of practical cooperation. Such understanding is the necessary basis of joint action to attain common purposes. The United States appeared to be striving to save Taiwan's seat in the General Assembly while admitting Peking to the Security Council. That appearance was almost, but not quite, believable. After all, Washington knew Peking would not accept half a loaf. Once the president announced his intentions of visiting China, it was a foregone conclusion that Peking would get in and Taiwan be expelled. The administration simply could not imperil the visit and the burgeoning Sino-American relationship by excluding Peking. Actually, Washington's ostentatiously warmer attitude toward Communist China ensured her admission. Wavering nations knew that voting for Peking would not really offend the United States. Mr. Elegant cheered this sellout of our best ally in favor of our worst enemy, describing it as creative hypocrisy. He said it was necessary to obtain, quote, the created purpose of gaining the UN seats for the People's Republic, which actually administers the vast mainland and some 750 million Chinese. And there's a asterisk down to this footnote which says, to his credit, Mr. Elegant uses the word administers rather than resorting to the creative hypocrisy used by liberals who claim that the Peking government represents 750 million people. The government of Red China represents only a small clique of top communists. And Robert Elegant assures us, as have so many others, that Peking's admission will not only strengthen the UN peacekeeping capacity, but will, at the least, open the door to UN activities like arms limitation and nuclear test ban talks. End quote. Meanwhile, according to Elegant, Mr. Nixon's creative hypocrisy will validate his credentials as a statesman. The ambassador from Pakistan, who voted to admit Red China and expel Free China, saluted our president's creative hypocrisy by declaring, I would like to acknowledge that President Nixon's new policy contributed to the victory. We've got some pictures here that are going to be worth getting on the record. I might zoom in a little bit so you can see these and read the text. So here we've got, above with President Wilson is Colonel E.M. House, the international insider who sold Wilson on the League of Nations. House was a founder of the Council on Foreign Relations, to which both Alger Hiss and Secretary of State Stettinius belonged when, upper right, and that's this picture here, they flanked President Truman at founding conference of the UN. Below, right, that's down here, is a UN insignia. Oh, sorry, no, that's this bit. Is a UN insignia designed by Carl Aldo Marzani to resemble the Soviet emblem. So on the left is the Soviet emblem, and that's the UN seal. Like Alger Hiss, the first UN Secretary General Marzani was a secret communist. In 1950, our State Department named America's 17 top UN planners. 16 were later identified under oath as communists. UN Secretary General U Thant is a dedicated Red who says, quote, Lenin was a man with ideals of peace in line with the aims of the UN Charter. All right. I didn't know that E.M. House, Colonel House, was a founder of the CFR. Or maybe I did know that. It's hard to remember all this stuff. Okay. carrying on with the article, Ambassador James Shen of Nationalist China praised Mr. Bush's efforts in behalf of Free China, but added sardonically, there seems to be a lack of coordination with the White House. Columnist Willard Edwards wrote that Shen, quote, hoped it wasn't deliberate. Anybody has the right to hope. Part of the charade called for Mr. Nixon to be outraged appropriately with the consequences of his own acts. After all, millions of Americans had watched via television as the UN humbled our country and cheered the defeat. But the presidential press secretary Ronald Ziegler assured newsmen that the defeat in the General Assembly will not affect our policy, and that Mr. Nixon has no intention to retaliate. And Ambassador Bush vouched for the fact that the Nixon administration, which even refused to use its veto in the Security Council to block the seating of the Maoists, will continue to support the virulently anti-American UN no matter what, as Ambassador Bush put it on November 1st, 1971. Quote, we are prepared to face this reality and act in accordance with it, even though it may cause us some grief, some arguments, some criticism. Quite obviously, it is going to take on what some have said is a bipolar institution and triangulate the power. Certainly, with Peking coming into the Security Council seat, we are going to have, at a minimum, a triangulation of power. I think you'll see Peking doing what many have predicted, championing the third world developing nations or attempting to. President Nixon has always supported the UN and will continue. We have no plans to do anything else. That's Bush Sr. When Ambassador Bush was running for the Senate from Texas in 1964, he took quite a different attitude. At that time, he maintained, quote, if Red China should be admitted to the United Nations, then the United Nations is hopeless and we should withdraw. And of course, Mr. Nixon built much of his political reputation on his own fervent opposition to the admission of Red China to the UN. Richard Nixon was even a member of the Committee of 1 Million, the largest organization devoted exclusively to fighting the admission of the Maoist government to the United Nations. Got a footnote here under the asterisk. Says the admission of Red China to the UN carried such a high priority with the establishment that 3 major television networks and 9 Washington and New York stations refused to sell time to the Committee of 1 Million for screening of a film warning against a US détente with Peking. During his 1968 quest for the presidency on the 19th of April, Mr. Nixon proclaimed, quote, I would not recognize Red China now, and I would not agree to admitting it to the United Nations, and I wouldn't go along with those well-intentioned people that said trade with them, because that may change them, because doing it now would only encourage them, the hardliners in Peking, and the hardline policy they're following. And it would have an immense effect in discouraging great numbers of non-communist elements in free Asia that are now just beginning to develop their own confidence. Richard Nixon no longer even refers to Communist China as Red China, but by Mao's ludicrous title, the People's Republic of China. After all, only 10 days after taking office, he had directed Henry Kissinger, his national security assistant, to lay plans for embracing Peking. One result was the orgy of anti-Americanism, which accompanied the expulsion of nationalist China from the United Nations. In the wake of what has been described as a diplomatic Pearl Harbor, many Americans are, for the first time, willing to take a second look at the United Nations. In order to understand the UN and the threat it poses to American liberty, one must go back to its dusty antecedents and examine the plan and the planners. A world government under a parliament of man has been an ideal of dreamers and schemers since ancient times. The dreamers envision perpetual world peace, a utopia in which the lion will sup with the lamb instead of dining on its carcass. The schemer bedazzles the dreamer with visions of permanently eliminating war, pestilence, famine, and want. He plays the idealists as Heifetz plays the violin. The schemer has other, less laudable goals. Among the most important of such schemers have been powerful international financiers and cartelists. Their goal was described by Montague Norman, former head of the Bank of England, who said they seek to assure that the hegemony of world finance should reign supreme over everyone, everywhere, as one whole supranational control mechanism. This hegemony or domination can only be established through a world government controlled from behind the scenes by the insiders of international finance. The leading representatives in America of this worldwide clique were the firms of J.P. Morgan and Company and Kuhn Loeb and Company. Members of these international banking concerns were primarily responsible for creating the Federal Reserve System in 1913, which gave them hegemony over America's banking system and thereby essential control over our economy. Next, these same men, largely through their control over key newspapers and through Colonel Edward Mandell House, their frontman who was the Henry Kissinger of the Wilson administration, worked mightily to push America into World War I. From the ashes of the war to end all wars, the insiders of international finance hoped to create a world government, the League of Nations, which would serve as a conduit for extending their hegemony over all world commerce and finance. One of the most important agents in this scheme was an operator named Theodore Marburg. Born in Maryland, an ardent scholar and successful businessman, Marburg had gone to Oxford University in 1893 to take a special course in economics and political science. There, he had been initiated into the conspiracy as a member of the Fabian Society, and according to Woodrow Wilson's biographer Jennings Wise, quote, his studies brought Marburg to the conclusion that the liberalization of the governments of the world through the medium of a League of Nations, with power residing in the hands of the international financiers to control its councils and enforce peace, would prove a specific for all the political ills of mankind. That's a name to look into, isn't it? Theodore Marburg joined the Fabian Society. I wonder what Oxford University college he went to. Any guesses? I know which ones I'd go for. I would guess All Souls, but... Returning to America, Marburg was supported by international financiers in a spectacular rise in the Republican leadership, and at the same time he began founding organizations to preach Fabianism among American intellectuals. It was Theodore Marburg who founded the American Association for International Conciliation, and later the League to Enforce Peace. What a name! The League to Enforce Peace. That reminds me, that's exactly what the UN troops did in Katanga. They went in to forcefully prevent civil war. That's what they said they were doing, right? Around such magnates of finance as Andrew Carnegie, Paul Warburg, Otto Kahn, Bernard Baruch, and Jacob Schiff. Names that I think we'll all probably be somewhat familiar with. But Marburg was handicapped because of his reputation as a Republican. When it became apparent that only the Democrat Party was likely to promote the Federal Reserve System and assure passage of the income tax amendment, Marburg was assigned the job of finding his own opposite number within the ranks of the Democrats. The task proved remarkably simple. Theodore Marburg contacted Colonel Edward Mandell House, a behind-the-scenes manipulator in the Democrat Party whose views paralleled Marburg's almost exactly. House was commissioned to find a Democrat candidate for president whom he could control. The man he found was Woodrow Wilson, who later described House as, quote, my alter ego or second self. It was through Marburg and House, serving as agents for international finance, that Wilson was sold the idea of championing a League of Nations. At the same time that the insiders of international finance were attempting to create a League of Nations, they were also sponsoring and financing the communist revolution in Russia. The Bolsheviks were bankrolled by a consortium of bankers, many of them cousins, from Wall Street, London, and Frankfurt. While J.P. Morgan and Company and the Rockefeller interests participated, the chief American sponsor was Jacob Schiff, a senior partner of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and an active sponsor of Fabian agent Theodore Marburg. As the New York Journal American reported on February the 3rd, 1949, quote, "Today it is estimated, even by Jacob's grandson John Schiff, a prominent member of New York society, that the old man sank about $20 million for the final triumph of Bolshevism in Russia." 20 million. Why did insiders of international finance support a movement whose ostensible purpose is to assure their own destruction? The answer is that they needed a geographical base for their revolutionary operations. Soviet communism would serve as the sword, while the Fabian movement promoted socialism in the West by use of the pen. Here were two arms of the same movement, with the violent arm distracting attention from the ultimately more dangerous non-violent arm. That's a real great example of the sort of dialectic and how you got the what is it? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So you've got the thesis, I suppose, of you've got the thesis of Christian free market, free trade, capitalism, unregulated by a centralized authority. That's the thesis. Then you've got the antithesis of the communists, Bolshevik uprising and their system of communism that they brought in. And the synthesis of that is what we're living in now, is the socialist system that we're living in. And you have this bloated, centralized bureaucracy, but they've managed to bring that about without killing people and starving people and murdering them so far. So good example of that. 1 second. I'm just going to have a sip. Following the armistice of November the 11th, 1918, Woodrow Wilson journeyed to Paris, accompanied by House, Thomson Lamont, a partner of J.P. Morgan and Company, and Paul Warburg, a partner of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. We've got a footnote here as well. Paul Warburg was known as the father of the Federal Reserve System and one of its original directors. His brother Max also attended the peace conference in Paris, but as a representative of Germany. It was Max who headed M.N. Warburg and Company, one of the world's largest international banks, and arranged for Lenin to be transported from Switzerland to Russia to lead the Bolshevik Revolution. Dr. E.J. Dillon, who attended the Paris Peace Conference, wrote, quote, "Mr. Wilson, who in the depths of his heart seems to have cherished a vague fondness for the Bolshevists there, which he sometimes manifested in utterances that startled the foreigners to whom they were addressed, dispatched through Colonel House some fellow countrymen of his to Moscow to ask for peace proposals which, according to the Moscow government, were drafted by himself and Messrs. House and Lansing." Lansing, that's a name we're familiar with as well. We heard a lot about Lansing in Fearful Master. Back to the article. A member of the delegation, Professor George Heron, is quoted by the Paris Herald Tribune of May the 21st, 1919, as observing, "I have said that certain great forces have steadily and occultly worked for a German peace. But I mean, in fact, one force, an international finance to which all other forces hostile to the freedom of nations and of the individual soul are contributory. The influence of this finance had permeated the conference." According to Professor Heron, one of the chief goals of the international financiers at Paris was to achieve, quote, "a recognition of the Bolshevik power as the de facto government of Russia." However, I just realized that I read straight through a footnote, second footnote there. I've already read it, so I won't read it again. But it's this bit here about Dr. E.J. Dillon backing up this idea that the international financiers wanted the Bolshevik regime to be recognized. However, European representatives, living in fear that the Bolshevik match might ignite a revolutionary tinderbox all over the continent, thwarted the insiders working to achieve this goal. And while Wilson and House bargained in Paris, disillusion was rapidly setting in back on Main Street. As the peace conference dragged on, it became more and more obvious to Americans that the war had not been a moral crusade at all, but had resulted from the machinations of venal politicians whose specialty was secret treaties hidden behind secret treaties, all for the benefit of the insiders of international finance. The American people quickly became skeptical about any involvement with such intriguers in a League of Nations. Facing a furious electorate, the Senate dared not ratify the treaty and the US did not join the League. Without America, the League of Nations was like a cotton plantation without cotton. But the peace conference was far from a total disaster for the conspirators. The Versailles Treaty, which betrayed the terms upon which Germany had agreed an armistice, was so written as to guarantee that within 2 decades the world would once again face general warfare. The insiders, anticipating a second chance, were determined to learn from their mistakes. They quickly established organizations in the major Western countries to propagandize for internationalism and idealize the concept of one world government. At the same time, they made every effort to encourage government policies aimed at furthering these objectives. The instrument they created to promote these goals in the United States is called the Council on Foreign Relations. And the man most responsible for its creation was the ubiquitous Colonel Edward Mandell House. Joining House in founding the CFR were such international financiers as Schiff, Lamont, Warburg, Kahn, Rockefeller, and Baruch, the very men who had been so anxious to collar the United States into the League of Nations. Stripped of its claptrap, the Charter of the Council on Foreign Relations reveals its purpose to be abolition of the United States in favor of a one-world superstate. And remember, the CFR is the American branch of the Royal Institute for International Affairs over in Britain, which was at Chatham House. Same people, they just have different names because the Americans wouldn't have been comfortable with something that had the word royal in the title. So that's why it was called the Council on Foreign Relations over there. It is doubtful that 1 American in 100 has ever heard of the Council on Foreign Relations, or that 1 in 1,000 can explain anything at all about its goals, despite the fact that its 1,450 members include some of the most famous men in America from the worlds of high finance, industry, government, the foundations, academy, and the mass media. The CFR operates in almost complete anonymity, yet nearly half of its members have served in the federal government, and President Nixon has appointed more than 100 members of the Council on Foreign Relations to key posts in his administration. Henry Kissinger, for example, came to the Nixon administration from a staff position at the CFR. And remember as well, when we read through some of the Rockefeller books, there was an account, I think it was in David's memoirs, that, or it was either in David's memoirs or it was in the Horowitz one, about how the world's leaders came and they all wanted to speak to the CFR. And that was around the time of the founding of the conference, the first conference of the founding of the UN, I think. I can't remember exactly the reference or the anecdote that it said that, but I remember it stood out to me. That's where you go if you want to talk to the people in charge. That's what Hillary Clinton said as well. When her office was moved and she was closer to the CFR, she was like, oh, now I don't have to go as far to find out what I need to say and what I need to do. The annual report of the Council on Foreign Relations for 1958 to 1959 discussed an informal talk made on May the 21st, 1959 by Walter Mallory. Then retiring after 32 years as executive director of the council, Mallory observed, quote, "When I cast my mind back to 1927, it seems little short of a miracle that the organization could have taken root in those days. You will remember that the United States had decided not to join the League of Nations. On the domestic front, the budget was extremely small, taxes were light, and we didn't even recognize the Russians. There were a few men who did not feel content in the comfortable isolationist climate. The CFR composed of just such uncomfortable men, working diligently to change all that. A record of 25 years, published privately by the Council on Foreign Relations in 1947, reveals how it achieved a hammerlock on American foreign policy. Quote, in 1939, Hamilton Fish Armstrong, editor of Foreign Affairs, and Walter H. Mallory, executive director of the Council, paid a visit to the Department of State to offer such aid on the part of the Council as might be useful and appropriate in view of the war. As a result of this meeting, the State Department authorized the CFR to form groups of experts to proceed with research under 4 general heads: security and armaments problems, economic and financial problems, political problems, and territorial problems. Then, according to the CFR, the Rockefeller Foundation was approached for a grant of funds to put the plan into operation. However, by February of 1941, the State Department took over the whole operation, absorbing the CFR's top operators into post-war planning activities. Remember, this was 10 months before Pearl Harbor. During World War II, it was increasingly taken for granted that as soon as the fighting was ended, a new international organization would be formed, and that it would be called the United Nations. Planning for creation of that organization was taken over by members of the CFR, lock, stock, and barrel of Borscht. The man termed, quote, the architect of the United Nations Charter by Time magazine in its issue for May 18, 1953, was Russian-born Leo Pazvolsky, who was a CFR, chief of the Division of Special Research in the State Department. Born of communist parents, Pazvolsky was raised a radical and infiltrated into our government in 1934. He rapidly rose to the key position from which he worked to effect the transfer of U.S. sovereignty to the United Nations. Working side by side with Pazvolsky in formulating the UN Charter was Alger Hiss, who was at the same time a member of the communists' Harold Wehr cell in Washington, a Soviet espionage agent, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Hiss played key roles at Yalta and Dumbarton Oaks, where agreements were worked out with the Soviets on the content of the UN Charter. According to lengthy testimony before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, it was Alger Hiss who sat at FDR's side as his top specialist on international organization. In 1950, the State Department issued an official report entitled Post-War Foreign Policy Preparation 1939 to 1945, which named the men who did the planning and shaped the policies that led to the creation of the New World Organization. That list and similar official records revealed these men to have been, in addition to Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White, Virginius Frank Coe, Dean Acheson, Noel Field, Lawrence Duggan, Henry Julian Wadley, John Carter Vincent, David Weintraub, Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, Harold Glasser, Victor Perlow, Irving Kaplan, Solomon Adler, Abraham George Silverman, William Ullman, and William Taylor. The State Department could hardly have anticipated what a disastrous confession this would prove to be, for since then, with the single exception of Dean Acheson, CFR, who had himself been hired by Joseph Stalin to serve as Soviet Russia's legal counsel in the United States, every one of those 17 men has been identified in sworn testimony as a communist agent. It is hardly startling that such men were willing to make every concession to the Soviets at Dumbarton, Oaks, Yalta, and at the official founding of the United Nations at San Francisco. The UN Charter was thus a product of both major arms of the international communist conspiracy. Our delegation to the San Francisco Conference in April of 1945 was headed by Secretary of State Edward Stettinius Jr., a member of the CFR and a former partner in the international banking firm of J.P. Morgan and Company. Serving as Secretary General of the conference was Alger Hiss, both a member of the CFR and a communist. Apologists for the UN never mentioned the key part Hiss played at Dumbarton, Oaks, and Yalta, where the general format of the UN was hammered out with the Soviets, nor his years of work with Pazvolsky in preparing plans for the international organization. And they have done their best to dismiss the role he played at the San Francisco conference. But a contemporary issue of Time magazine noted, even in advance of the San Francisco conference, quote, Alger Hiss will be an important figure there, as Secretary General managing the agenda, he will have a lot to say behind the scenes about who gets the breaks. He certainly did. The US Treasury's representative at the San Francisco conference was Harry Dexter White, who gave special attention to the establishment of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, which has had such an influence on the writing of textbooks from our schools. But White's main duty was establishment of the World Bank, an institution dear to the hearts of the insiders of high finance. Subsequently, Harry Dexter White was identified in sworn testimony by both Elizabeth Bentley and Whittaker Chambers as a Soviet agent who gave them stolen government documents for transmittal to the Kremlin. White's lieutenant at San Francisco was William Ullman, also identified by Miss Bentley as a member of the Communist Underground. Yet another key advisor at the San Francisco conference was Dalton Trumbo, who served as a ghostwriter for Stettinius and others. A wealthy screenwriter, Trumbo later was identified as a member of the Communist Party and was one of the infamous Hollywood 10, who were sentenced to jail for contempt of Congress as a result of their behavior before a congressional committee investigating communist activities in the movie industry. Working in tandem with the 17 or so Soviet spies at San Francisco were 43 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Some of the more interesting CFR members in the delegation had strong international banking ties. They included John Foster Dulles, J. Henry Schroeder Bank, the bank that financed Hitler, Edward R. Stettinius, J.P. Morgan and Company, Nelson Rockefeller, whose family controls Chase Manhattan Bank and First National City Bank, John J. McCloy, Chairman of the Board, Chase Manhattan, and Artemus Gates, New York Trust Company. At the conclusion of the San Francisco conference, it was Olga Hiss who was entrusted with taking the charter to Washington. On page 23 of Life magazine for July the 16th, 1945, was a picture of the week showing Hiss arriving in Washington with a large package. The caption read, quote, "At the conclusion of the San Francisco conference, the Charter of the United Nations was bundled off to a waiting plane and gingerly placed in a 75-pound fireproof safe equipped with a small parachute. Attached to the safe was a stern inscription, 'Finder, do not open. Notify the Department of State, Washington, D.C.' Chief custodian was Conference Secretary General Olga Hiss, shown here with the charter at the end of the cross-country trip. The Chicago Tribune of June 11, 1945, described the presentation of the United Nations Charter to the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. Quote, "The hearings in Washington started, appropriately enough, with a lengthy statement read by Mr. Stettinius, but apparently written by Mr. Pasvolsky. When the time came to ask questions, Mr. Stettinius gracefully yielded the center of the stage to the same Mr. Pasvolsky who knows all the answers. This is more than a little odd. Mr. Pasvolsky's expertism is said to result from the fact that he wrote the original draft of the treaty, but that was quite a long time ago, and his work, meanwhile, has undergone considerable modification. Nobody has yet explained why the department entrusted the drafting of this document to a foreign-born functionary whose training has been in economics rather than diplomacy. It is even more curious that the natives among our delegates, two of whom are members of the Senate Committee, did not assert for themselves the right of interpretation. The diffidence, if that is the word for it, of Mr. Connolly and Mr. Vandenberg, to say nothing of Mr. Stettinius and the rest, has given the country the impression that it is really Mr. Pasvolsky's treaty, not theirs, that he understands it and they don't, that men with a good deal of experience in foreign affairs, who were themselves participants in the negotiations, have only an incomplete grasp of the content and purpose of this intricate and difficult document. They were at San Francisco, it appears, to assist him rather than he to assist them. Only 5 days of testimony about the Charter were heard by the committee. A few raised their voices against this permanent entangling alliance, but their voices were a whisper in the wilderness. So universal was the managed acclaim for the UN Charter, sight unseen, that it was ratified by the Senate on July the 28th, virtually without debate, and few had bothered to read the thing. The vote was 89-2. The two senators who voted against the charter had read it. The senators would have done well to inspect the UN Charter more carefully. It bears a remarkable resemblance to the Constitution of the Soviet Union. Many of the phrases and clauses employed in both documents are virtually identical. Cleon Skousen, former assistant to the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, notes in his book The Naked Capitalist, quote, "Anyone familiar with the Communist Constitution of Russia will recognize in the United Nations Charter a similar format. It is characterized by a fervent declaration of democratic principles which are sound and desirable. This is then followed by a constitutional restriction or procedural limitation which completely nullifies the principles just announced." The Charter also gives the USSR 3 votes in the General Assembly under the hypocritical guise that the Soviet states of Ukraine and Belarusia are independent republics. This little ploy was worked out between Stalin and Olga Hiss, but America has yet to hear the first liberal complaint about it, or so much as a suggestion that Belarusia and the Ukraine receive the sort of treatment just accorded to nationalist China. There is also a striking resemblance between the UN flag and the Soviet arms banner, highest emblem in the communist heraldry, found on the cover of the Constitution of the USSR. That this is something other than coincidence is attested to by the fact that the UN flag was created and designed by Carl Aldo Marzani, head of the presentation branch of the US Office of Strategic Services. Marzani was later found to be a member of the Communist Party who operated under the party name of Tony Wales. Attempting to explain away the incredible appeasement of the Soviets at Dumbarton Oaks, Yalta, and at the San Francisco Conference, liberal folklore has it that Stalin and company had to be cajoled into joining the UN. The truth is that the Bolsheviks couldn't have been kept out unless the door were barred with a steel plank. As Earl Browder, former General Secretary of the Communist Party USA and twice its candidate for President of the United States, wrote in his book Victory and After, quote, "The American communists worked energetically and tirelessly to lay the foundations for the United Nations, which we were sure would come into existence." And a formal preamble to the Constitution of the Communist Party USA states that the party believes, quote, "The true national interest of our country and the cause of peace and progress require the strengthening of the United Nations as a universal instrument of peace." Political Affairs is the official theoretical journal of the Communist Party USA, through which the official party line is transmitted to comrades and the much larger body of party sympathizers. In April 1945, 2 months before the San Francisco Conference, Political Affairs published the following directive, quote, "Great popular support and enthusiasm for the United Nations policies should be built up, well organized and fully articulate. The opposition must be rendered so impotent that it will be unable to gather any significant support in the Senate against the United Nations Charter and the treaties which will follow." A corollary to the liberal myth that the communists did not really want to be included in the UN is that the World Organization has proved a constant thorn in the side of the Soviets and their satellites, producing constant frustration, as symbolized by Khrushchev pounding his shoe on the lectern of the General Assembly. It was good showbiz, but that is all it was. A former Czechoslovakian intelligence officer, Colonel Jan Buchar, has testified before the House Committee on Un-American Activities that he heard a General Bondarenko deliver a lecture at the Frunze Military Academy in Moscow, in which the Soviet general declared, quote, "From the rostrum of the United Nations, we shall convince the colonial and semi-colonial people to liberate themselves and to spread the communist theory over all the world. We recognize the UN as no authority over the Soviet Union, but the United Nations serves to deflect the capitalists and warmongers in the Western world." Dr. Marek Korowicz, a member of Communist Poland's delegation at the UN who eluded his guards and sought asylum in the United States, put it well when he said, quote, "The Communist Party regards the UN as the most important platform of Soviet propaganda in the world." On October the 7th, 1961, the West Coast newspaper of the Communist Party, The People's World, actually carried an editorial entitled Save the UN. It declared in part, quote, "The UN commands a great reservoir of support in our country. This support should now be made vocal. People should write President Kennedy, telling him, 'Do not withdraw from UN. Restore UN to the grand design of Franklin Roosevelt.'" New Times, an official Soviet publication printed in Moscow, reported in its issue for July the 8th, 1970, as stressed by Premier Kosygin on June the 19th, the Soviet Union attaches much importance to the United Nations. In the future, as in the past, it will spare no effort to steer the organization's work. It is equally fictitious to claim, as did the CFR's James Reston in a recent column, that the communists want the United States to get out of the United Nations. If the US gets out of the UN collapses as a springboard for communist attempts at world domination, and the comrades know it. On January the 21st, 1962, the official communist newspaper, The Worker, carried an article headlined, "Birchers Take Warpath Against UN Peace Hopes." The Communist Worker warned the comrades, quote, "The John Birch Society has instructed its members to prepare a hate campaign against the United Nations in his secret bulletin for members. Robert Welsh orders his followers to place this anti-United Nations drive at the top of their 1962 political agenda. It was in the spring of last year that the ultra-hate campaign to destroy the United Nations actually began." Interesting, they label it as a hate campaign, with all the stuff that's going on at the moment in various countries to criminalize hate speech. And of course, that is always defined subjectively. What is hate speech? And how do you prove it, you know? So very, it reminds me of the opening of Fabian Freeway, where she says that anyone who criticizes the socialists, the socialism, the Fabian socialist movement and their ideas, and anyone who criticized them were labeled as far-right extremists. And she wrote that back in 1966. So the labeling, the tactics is gone on and carried on and remained the same throughout all that time. Still labeling as far-right extremists full of hate anyone who says, you know, maybe we don't want global technocratic communism. Just saying. Far-right, hate-filled extremist. This is just crazy. The Birch Society's education campaign was very effective indeed. Then came the counterattack. In late 1964 and early 1965, the Xerox Corporation sponsored a national primetime television series to propagandize for the UN. In commenting on one of these programs in its issue of July the 23rd, 1965, the Communist People's World noted, quote, "It's not a little horrifying that in our country at this time a pitch is needed for the UN and for peace, but that is the case, and we're all for figuratively hitting people over the head with the message. The Xerox program did that." Meanwhile, the communists have continued to solidify their UN control. So complete had it become by 1965 that Mikhail Sergeyevich Lvov, an official Soviet spokesman on UN affairs, told a Moscow radio audience on June the 27th, 1965, quote, "There can be no doubt that with the United Nations constituted as it is at present, the consistent line of the Soviet Union in pressing for the United Nations to face fully up to the problems of strengthening peace and ensuring freedom is producing more and more positive results." Of course, the communists have controlled the UN staff from the beginning. The Secretary General has traditionally been portrayed as the epitome of neutralism, the ideal non-communist. But Trygve Lie, the first UN Secretary General, was a dedicated socialist and a high-ranking member of the Democratic Labour Party of Norway, a spur of the Communist International. After the resignation of Dr. Lie, Dag Hammarskjöld was elected to fill the office. He too was a self-declared socialist and openly approved the goals of world communism. Hammarskjöld even refused to support a very timid resolution condemning Red China's invasion and genocide in Tibet. After Dag Hammarskjöld was killed in a plane crash in 1961, the Soviets pressed demands for leadership to be shored by a three-man troika. Then, suddenly, they turned off their troika talk and backed Burmese Marxist U Thant as Hammarskjöld's successor. According to Thant, socialism ought to be the wave of the future for rich and poor alike. A dedicated apostle of world government, Secretary General Thant is a consistent supporter of the communists who deplores America's suspicion of communist motives. Thant, both a Marxist and a Leninist, is openly running the UN to support communist purposes. The following is the complete text of an Associated Press report as it appeared in the Los Angeles Times for April 7th, 1970. Quote, UN Secretary General U Thant praised Vladimir Lenin, founder of the Soviet Union, as a political leader whose ideals were reflected in the UN Charter. That Thant released Monday the text of a statement sent to a symposium on Lenin at Tampere, Finland, sponsored by the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. Lenin was a man with a mind of great clarity and incisiveness, and his ideas have had a profound influence on the course of contemporary history, Thant's statement said. Lenin's ideals of peace and peaceful coexistence among states have won widespread international acceptance, and they are in line with the aims of the UN Charter. Clearly, the Soviets got their troika when they got Thant. He has had two primary assistants, one a Soviet national and the other Dr. Ralph Bunche, CFR. Dr. Bunche, who had been an assistant to Olga Hiss, has been identified under oath as a member of the Communist Party by both Manning Johnson and Leonard Patterson, former top communists, in closed hearings before a government loyalty board. They had attended cell meetings with Comrade Bunche. Patterson and Johnson, both Negroes, had been trained in Moscow, but defected from the party when they became aware that the communists were working to enslave people of all races. Ultimate control of the United Nations is in the hands of the members of the permanent staff of the Secretariat, where resolutions and edicts of the General Assembly and Security Council are either neutralized or given teeth with which to bite. The United Nations has approximately 6,000 employees in the Secretariat. About one-fourth of these hold supervisory and policy-making positions classified as professional. These professional appointments are filled according to the geographic origin of the member nations and in proportion to their contribution to the UN budget. The United States meets approximately one-third of that budget and is therefore entitled to approximately one-third of the professional appointments. The other two-thirds come from the other member nations, communist as well as non-communist. And, as US News and World Report observed as early as December 12, 1952, quote, an informed estimate suggests that as many as one-half of the 1,350 administrative executives in the UN are either communists or people who are willing to do what they want. They being the communists, I assume, in that sentence. The situation is so serious that when a New York federal grand jury stumbled across evidence of communist penetration into the American staff of the UN, it so alarmed the grand jury that it conducted a full-scale inquiry into the matter. Enough evidence was presented to enable the grand jury to release the following statement, quote, this jury must, as a duty to the people of the United States, advise the court that startling evidence has disclosed infiltration into the UN of an overwhelmingly large group of disloyal US citizens, many of whom are closely associated with the international communist movement. This group numbers scores of individuals, most of whom have long records of federal employment and, at the same time, have been connected with persons and organizations subversive to this country. Their positions at the time we subpoenaed them were ones of trust and responsibility in the UN Secretariat and in its specialized agencies. The resultant publicity prompted the Senate Committee on the Judiciary to initiate its own investigation, with the same results. The chairman of that Senate Committee released the following statement at the conclusion of those hearings, quote, I am appalled at the extensive evidence indicating that there is today in the UN, among the American employees there, the greatest concentration of communists that this committee has ever encountered. Those American officials who have been called represent a substantial percentage of the people who are representing us in the UN. These people occupy high positions. They have high salaries, and almost all of these people have, in the past, been employees in the US government in high and sensitive positions. I believe that the evidence shows that the security officers of our government knew, or at least had reason to know, that these people have been the subject of charges before Congress. Have been communists for many years. In fact, some of these people have been the subject of charges before Congress before and during their employment with the UN. It is more than strange that such a condition existed in the government of the US, and it is certainly more than strange that these people should be transferred to the UN and charged to the American quota. The point was well summed up by Mr. Joseph Kornfeder, a former top communist who was trained in Moscow, when he spoke before the Congress of Freedom in 1955. Quote, "How many communists, fellow travelers and sympathizers there are among the UN employees, no one seems to know. But judging by their number among the American personnel, there can be no doubt that the communists control the UN and its staff association and use it for all it's worth. Which means that most of the special agencies at UN headquarters are, in fact, operated by them and coordinated through the communist cell in the UN Staff Association. Given the complexion of the UN staff, the headquarters of the UN could hardly be located in a worse place from the standpoint of American security. When the Rockefeller family donated the land on the East River for construction of the house that Hiss built, the Soviets were delighted. One of their delegates, Mr. Saskin, even served on the site selection committee, and the Manhattan-based UN has provided the communists with the best possible center for subversive operations, as FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover has testified. Quote, "Attention is called to the fact that many of the incidents and causes previously cited involved Soviet employees of the United Nations. They are guests of the United States and are supposedly dedicated in the cause of international peace, but they are, in fact, carefully selected envoys of the international communist conspiracy, trained in trickery and deceit and dedicated to the concept of fully exploiting the freedoms of the countries they seek to destroy. It is too much to expect that they would not subvert the United Nations." The nationally syndicated columnist Henry J. Taylor adds, quote, "FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover reports that 865 Soviet bloc personnel and more than 1,200 dependents, all with diplomatic immunity against arrest, and most of them accredited to the United Nations, are not to the United States, are stationed here. His bureau estimates that about 80% of the Soviet bloc personnel are intelligence officers and not diplomats at all. Nothing could be a heavier, easier, and quicker blow to red espionage than to put the UN headquarters elsewhere." In his nationally syndicated column of October 7, 1971, Paul Scott comments on the effect of adding the Red Chinese to the already huge bank of communist spies in the United Nations. "Espionage will be an even greater danger now that Red China has been admitted to the UN. Since the size of each country's UN delegation and staff reflects the size of the country's population, and since Red China has between 700 and 800 million people, she might be allowed 3,000 or more diplomats and staff members, each of whom would possess diplomatic immunity. Their suitcases and trunks could not be examined by American customs officials. Would that suggest wholesale, unimpeded importation of heroin into this country, in addition to countless spying activities? The most obvious and practical solution to the drug and spying dangers to our country is to get the US out of the United Nations and the UN out of the United States." Before the admission of Red China to the UN, J. Edgar Hoover testified concerning the consequence of such a development. Quote, "Communist China represents one of the greatest long-range security threats, and the FBI is continuing to devote its close attention to coverage of possible Chinese communist agents and sympathizers in the United States. There is every likelihood that Chinese communist intelligence activities in this country will increase in the next few years, particularly if Communist China is recognized by the United Nations and is thereby able to have a diplomatic mission in this country. And Red China had wasted no time in moving its spies into the UN headquarters, as Human Events reported in its issue for November the 20th, 1971. Red China's 22-man United Nations delegation received a tumultuous reception upon its arrival in New York last week, with the press seeming to tumble over itself with compliments for the high quality of Mao's diplomatic representatives. But even as the new delegation was being hailed by various groups in this country, evidence is accumulating that Red China intends to employ the UN as a major tool for promoting Maoist-style espionage and subversion. China's Deputy Foreign Minister Cao Kunhua, head of the first Peking delegation to the UN, is a top intelligence operative for Peking. Chao's deputy, Huang Hua, is described by American intelligence sources as a gifted saboteur and espionage artist. The radical Chicago Sun-Times, displaying typical liberal nonchalance toward the communist use of the UN as a base for spying, said it was assumed Red China would include spies in its delegation. Quote, but Peking, moved into the international diplomatic spotlight for the first time, had not been expected to get into the game so soon, especially with men of such flagrant reputations for espionage as Xiao Kunhua and Huang Hua. Never in recorded history has a nation permitted an avowed enemy openly to pursue its policies of conquest on its home territory within so vast a diplomatic sanctuary, a sanctuary supposedly dedicated to peace. At least, Steuben should be employed to remodel the glass palace on the East River in the shape of a Trojan horse. On the surface, however, the UN often appears to be ludicrous, a sort of Mad Hatter's dream. More than half of the nations in the UN have fewer people than New York. A fifth of all UN members have populations under 2 million. These are the microstates. Their per capita gross national product is as low as $50 annually. Yet each of these nations has a vote equal to ours, with the result that nations such as Qatar, Bahrain, Bhutan, and Oman now hold the balance of power in the General Assembly. This has been caused by the fragmentation of the former French and British empires into a veritable plethora of tin horn nations, all of which resulted from a deliberate policy of the insiders of international finance, who know that in most cases they can buy the political leaders of the new mini-states, each of which has a vote equal to ours. Liberal propagandists, however, beg us not to be upset by this. As journalist William Ryan recently put it, quote, attempts to downgrade the voting status of present smaller members could, in the view of seasoned diplomats, do much damage. Ah, those seasoned diplomats. While America has only one of the 168 votes in the General Assembly, it pays approximately 1/3 of the UN's bills. Periodically, the United States also buys UN bonds to keep the Trojan horse from sinking into a quagmire of red ink. These bonds are guaranteed to be repaid the day after the Confederate war debt is amortized in full. The Communist bloc is the major debtor in the World Organization, being a grand total of $118.7 billion in arrears, that's dollars, and accounting for 2/3 of the UN's total debt. The fact that the US must carry a vastly disproportionate share of the UN's financial load, even as the Reds shirk theirs, quite naturally makes Americans angry. But it is probably the least important complaint about the UN. The real threat it poses to our nation lies in the fact that so many responsible Americans, many of them in high political office, are committed to a program to convert the UN into an international superstate, the long-time goal of the insiders who manipulate the communist conspiracy. If the insiders of international finance and industry intend to own and control the resources of the entire planet, then it follows that there must be a government empowered to protect their property and empire. So the conspirators work to establish their world superstate, both through their eminently respectable fronts, like the Council on Foreign Relations, which openly proclaims that its goal is a new world order, and through the communists who forthrightly maintain dictatorship can be established only by a victory of socialism in different countries or groups of countries, after which the proletariat republics would unite on federal lines and with those already in existence, and this system of federal unions would expand at length, forming the world union of socialist Soviet republics. This is why Red China had to be admitted to the United Nations, as James Reston, resident savant of the New York Times and apparent spokesman for the establishment insiders, has expressed it. Quote, "The President's forthcoming talks with Chou En-lai are only the beginning of a long process in which disagreements on specific questions are unavoidable, but the clear objective of which is the creation of mutual respect leading to a better world order. Is it clear that no really effective new world order can be created without the help of the Chinese communists?" The most vocal organization working to convince Americans to accept such a new world order is the United World Federalists, a group whose membership is heavily interlocked with that of the Council on Foreign Relations. The openly expressed purpose of the World Federalists is to convert the UN into a world government encompassing both communist and non-communist states. Speaking for the insiders, financier James Warburg, whose father was primarily responsible for creation of the Federal Reserve System and whose relatives financed the communist revolution in Russia, told a Senate committee on February 17, 1950, quote, "We shall have world government whether you like it or not, if not by consent, by conquest." According to the United World Federalists, quote, "The United Nations offers the best available basis for world peace if it can be given adequate power to make, interpret, and enforce world law. We believe this can be achieved by amendments to the United Nations Charter." The amendments, which they recommend, include turning over all military weapons to a UN army, giving the UN authority to tax, removing the veto from the executive branch, requiring universal membership without the right of secession, and empowering a court system with jurisdiction over all nations and individuals. President Nixon is, of course, far too clever actually to join the World Federalists, but he has actively supported their legislative program since his early days in Congress. In the October 1948 issue of the United World Federalist publication World Government News, on page 14, there appears the following announcement. Quote, "Richard Nixon introduced World Government Resolution HCR 68, 1947, and ABC World Government Resolution 1948. Of special interest to the UWF throughout its history has been its campaign to repeal the Connolly Reservation, whereby the United States has reserved to itself the power to decide what matters are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the US, and therefore may not be brought under the jurisdiction of the World Court. The Federalists want repeal of the Connolly Reservation, which would mean that the United States would accept as binding the ruling of the International Court of Justice on disarmament, on interpretation of the UN Charter and laws, and of international treaties. The abolition of the Connolly Reservation would leave us at the mercy of the Afro-Asian and Iron Curtain blocs that dominate the UN. It would be tantamount to surrendering American sovereignty to our enemies and would thus be a gross violation of the presidential oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Yet Richard Nixon has for many years advocated the repeal of that Connolly Reservation. Incredulous patriots who wrote Nixon about his advocacy of its repeal were sent a copy of a letter dated April 14, 1960, from Richard Nixon to Eugene Pulliam, publisher of the Phoenix Republic and Gazette, in which Nixon flatly stated that he favored such repeal, declaring, "I believe that the intervening years have shown that our so-called self-judging reservation is no longer necessary." President Nixon, whose warm endorsements of their program are widely distributed by the World Federalists, actually goes far beyond seeking repeal of the Connolly Reservation and openly advocates world rule through world law. The official slogan of the United World Federalists, in which the World Court is to be made the Supreme Court of the world. A world government naturally necessitates a world tax system. The UN has already requested a worldwide sales tax, which would coincidentally fall on items purchased in greatest abundance by Americans. But Americans would not now sit still for being taxed directly by the UN, and such propositions as the global sales tax will have to wait until we are locked into a world superstate from which we have no right of secession. In the meantime, the Nixon administration is preparing schemes to ship as much tax money out the back door to the UN as possible. The Department of State Bulletin for October the 5th, 1970, contains Mr. Nixon's message entitled Foreign Assistance for the 70s, in which the President states, "The future of American youth is directly related to the future of the United Nations," and recommends that foreign aid be greatly expanded and channeled through the UN and its subsidiary organizations, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. It has long been a goal of the internationalist insiders to channel American foreign aid through the UN. The next step will be to have the General Assembly determine the amount of foreign aid that we will be required to pay and to whom. On December the 17th, 1968, President-elect Nixon told reporters following a visit to the UN, "It is our intention in these days ahead to do everything that we can to strengthen this organization." The ultimate move to strengthen the UN is to give it a monopoly on military power. Up until that time, the US can still get out of the UN, regardless of how anyone may interpret the Charter. The object is to disarm the United States in favor of a UN army. On June the 23rd, 1961, John J. McCloy, special advisor to the President on disarmament, sent to the White House the draft of a bill to create a U.S. disarmament agency. Mr. McCloy was at the time chairman of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations. In his letter of transmittal to the President, he revealed that the fundamental purpose of the disarmament agency would be to bring about world government. In September 1961, Congress passed the Arms Control and Disarmament Act, conferring on the director of the new disarmament agency broad authority under the general supervision of the President and the Secretary of State to do just about anything the director might believe to be in the interest of peace. Many congressmen supported creation of this disarmament agency because they were afraid of being accused of opposing peace. Not all, however, withered under liberal pressure. Congressman John Ashbrook of Ohio referred to it as the Surrender Agency and declared, "The testimony is replete with evidence which indicates this agency may well be the back door for the one-worlders to accomplish their goal." The late Congressman James Utt commented that it was almost word-for-word duplication of a disarmament proposal advanced by Khrushchev in 1959. This formal disarmament proposal was later published in a 19-page report entitled Freedom from War, the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. It calls for transferring control of U.S. nuclear weapons to the United Nations, restricting the American military to the role of an internal police force, and establishing an all-powerful UN army. This U.S. disarmament plan further provides, quote, "The parties to the treaty would progressively strengthen the United Nations peace force until it had sufficient armed forces and armaments so that no state could challenge it." The Disarmament Agency's Dr. Lincoln P. Bloomfield, CFR, has written, quote, "Short of a major catastrophe, the difficulties in obtaining widespread public approval and explicit Senate ratification of a genuine world government are obvious. Without disarmament, such a system is probably unobtainable. If world government came about as a series of unnerving trips to or over the brink, it could come about at any time." Thus, The threat of the Soviets dropping nuclear bombs on us is built up so that we can be blackmailed into accepting world government through national disarmament in favor of a UN peace force. The insiders have no intention of destroying that which they intend to own and control. If there truly were a military threat from an independent Russia, the crowd at the CFR would be leading the parade for American independence and arms superiority. They would not be promoting disarmament. That's an interesting point, isn't it? The original plan of the conspirators for the disarmament of the United States and the transfer of our weaponry to the UN called for its completion by 1972, but American conservatives, led by the John Birch Society, gave the plan such exposure in the early 60s that the timetable had to be altered. Conservatives ordered and distributed to their alarmed friends so many copies of the State Department publication 7277 that the department was forced to let it go out of print. An article in the Communist World Marxist Review emphasized the need for patience, advising the comrades, quote, "Communists do not adhere to the all-or-nothing principle. Anything that brings disarmament nearer is a step forward." It was back to patient gradualism, which is the Fabian socialist way, of course. Americans were not yet sufficiently fed up with protracted no-win wars, nor were they sufficiently frightened by nuclear propaganda to swallow disarmament in favor of a UN army. A Gallup poll in 1961 determined that 81% of Americans said they would rather fight an all-out nuclear war than live under communist rule. 81%. I'd like to see what the numbers are today for that same poll. More time was needed for anti-military and defeatist propaganda. The Vietnam War has provided the excuse for an enormous escalation of such propaganda. Creation of the mood for acceptance by America of the program outlined by the State Department in 1961 has obviously been a high priority of the international communist conspiracy. Meanwhile, disarmament talks have been going on with the Russians for nearly 8 years. During that time, we have negotiated with them the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, with no inspection, of course, the Outer Space Treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Seabeds Treaty. All of these were steps towards SALT, and SALT is another step toward complete disarmament and world government. The objectives laid down by the insiders in State Department Document 7277 have not changed. In 1968, an Arms Control and Disarmament Agency publication called Arms Control and National Security explained what has been happening. Quote, "Since 1959, the agreed ultimate goal of the negotiations has been general and complete disarmament, i.e., the total elimination of all armed forces and armaments, except those needed to maintain internal order within states and to furnish the United Nations with peace forces. US and Soviet plans for general and complete disarmament were proposed in 1962, and they are still on the table. Some basic differences between the two plans are brought out by the key issue of timing and verification of reduction of nuclear delivery vehicles. Under the Charter of the UN, this international peace force with our nuclear weapons would be under the command of the Under Secretary General for Political and Security Council Affairs, who has control over all UN military affairs. Except for one 2-year term when it was occupied by a Yugoslav communist, this post has by agreement always been held by a Soviet national. Trygve Lie, Secretary General of the United Nations from 1946 to 1953, writes in his autobiography, In the Cause of Peace, quote, "Mr. Wyszynski did not delay his approach. He was the first to inform me of an understanding which the Big Five had reached in London on the appointment of a Soviet national as Assistant Secretary General for Political and Security Council Affairs. Mr. Statinius, under the influence of Alger Hiss, confirmed to me that he had agreed with the Soviet delegation in the matter." Former UN Secretary General Lee then observed, quote, "The preservation of international peace and security was the organization's highest responsibility, and it was to entrusting the direction of the Secretariat Department most concerned with this to a Soviet national that the Americans had agreed. What did the Americans want for themselves? To my surprise, they did not ask for a department concerned with comparable substantive affairs like the economic or the social. Rather, Mr. Stettinius proposed that an American citizen be appointed Assistant Secretary General for Administrative and Financial Services. Despite the fact that this agreement was to be binding for only 5 years, a Russian continues to occupy that key UN military office today. Mr. Nixon has not been so rude as to suggest that the office be given to anyone other than a communist. If everything else concerning the UN were favourable to the United States, the very fact that its military affairs are always in the hands of a communist should be more than sufficient reason to get us out. But liberal apologists for the UN are not bothered one iota by communist control of the organization's military. They explain, if you can believe this, that while the Soviets hold some posts by custom and tradition, the US holds others. It just happens to be the custom, thanks to Comrade Hiss, that the communists control the military while an American controls mosquito abatement projects. Fair's fair, you know. Is that UN army a possibility in the near future? United Press International has reported that, early in October 1971, Communist Poland offered the UN a standby force from its army for possible use in peacekeeping operations. Poland is the second Soviet bloc nation to offer its troops for peacekeeping, the other offer having been made 2 years ago by Czechoslovakia. Add to this the fact that Richard Nixon has long advocated just such a military force, which, as we have pointed out, would serve under the command of a Russian national at the United Nations. As the Los Angeles Examiner reported on October the 28th, 1950, quote, a strong effort to obtain approval of his resolution calling for establishment of a United Nations police force will be made by Congressman Richard Nixon when Congress reconvenes November the 27th, the California senatorial nominee said today. Nixon's resolution suggests that a UN policy authority be set up on a permanent basis to consist of land, sea, and air forces. It would swing into action against aggression under decision of a simple majority vote of the police authority. Establishment spokesman James Reston declared in his New York Times column of May 21st, 1971, quote, Nixon would obviously like to preside over the creation of a new world order and believes he has an opportunity to do so in the last 20 months of his first term. If Mr. Nixon gets what he wants, his new world order could well include a nuclear-equipped UN army controlled by a Soviet national. Given such dangers, why do we retain membership in the United Nations? Certainly the UN has not brought peace to the world. During the first 25 years of its existence, noted the liberal Houston Chronicle for September 25th, 1971, there have been 75 wars. Since the inception of the UN, over 1 billion people have been enslaved by the communists. This is a peace organization? The fact is that the existence of the UN makes war neither more nor less likely, but our continued participation in it could well guarantee our eventual enslavement. The UN is not harmless. It is not a guarantor of peace. It is a Trojan horse and a death trap. It is a threat to our national security. We are not unaware that the pet propagandists of the establishment insiders will shriek and scream that this warning is biased and unfair. They will beg you to pay no attention to doomsayers and then predict doom if America abandons the UN. They will implore you not to pay attention to the growing danger, not to worry about it, not to come to conclusions which favour the national interests of your country. Have faith, they will say. Have faith and believe. But more and more Americans are coming out from under the ether of 25 years of UN propaganda. They are reaching the only possible conclusion that an American can draw when presented with the facts. That conclusion is that it is time to get us out of the UN and the UN out of the US. And that was a reprint of Get Us Out by Gary Allan. American Opinion. Written, so this is 1972, I think it was published. Yeah, January 1972. I'll grab that link as well and drop that in the chat for anybody who wants to get a hold of it, right? Because you might want to download that for yourself. Oh, it's telling me that the link's too long. Oh, muted. That was much longer than I expected it to be. I don't know how long I was muted there for. Apologies. I just got the link to the Wikipedia article there, and you can scroll down to download electronic PDF copy of that article that I just read. That's what I was saying. That's what I was saying while I was muted, that I was looking for the link and I just put it in the 3 chats. So wherever you are, Odyssey, Rumble, or YouTube, there's a link to the Gary Allan Wikipedia article. Scroll down to the bottom. You can download PDFs of some of, well, not his books, but his articles. So I thought that was quite a powerful booklet. I want to say article, but it took much longer to get through than I expected, and my voice is really struggling. I'm not sure what it is, but my voice is struggling tonight. We got Christine in the chat. Rosemary as well. Good evening. Thank you for joining. Antikovic's asking me if I'm drinking vodka. No, I'm not. Slightly salted water. How do I keep ending up muted? I don't know how that keeps happening. Apologies, everybody. I keep muting myself accidentally somehow. I think it's when I'm taking sips. I'm trying to mute myself so that you don't have to listen to me slurping water and coughing and clearing my throat. And then I keep failing to unmute. I think that's what's going on. I was just saying that article took much longer to read than I expected, and my voice is really sore. So I am actually quite tempted to wrap up pretty soon and then come back on Thursday to finish the other bits, because I just keep coughing and my mouth keeps drying out, and I don't know what it is. I think it's just because I've been up since about 4 o'clock this morning. Just getting a bit tired. But that was a really good article, I thought, tying together the international financiers with the CFR, and reinforcing what we read in the Rockefeller books. I think that was part 7 when we did the quotes from the Rockefeller books, because they donated the land on which the UN building was constructed. They're very much tied into the formation of the UN, and David Rockefeller himself was an internationalist who brought relations in closely with America and China. Then Nelson Rockefeller, who I think he was a vice president, he was also hanging around at the founding conference of the UN That's what we read in the Horowitz biography. Anti-COVID says we can handle a few slurps and coughs. Some people can't though. They get really triggered by that stuff, and then they send me a all caps message. Stop. I did get told to stop swallowing once. I was obviously like, but you know, sometimes you talk for a long time and you get a lot of you get a lot of saliva builds up, and you gotta deal with it. I'm usually pretty good at muting and unmuting. I usually don't cock up so often. But yeah, I'm just a bit too trigger happy with that mute button. But I think I'm going to wrap it there. That was a really good article, and I would encourage people to check out Gary Allen's work. So many quotes in there, so many quotes, not only from critical, publications critical of the UN and critical of the communistic roots, but also publications that are pro, and just saying it outright, just saying how infiltrated the UN was as an organization, how it just kind of, as he said, was a Trojan horse, which enabled all this spying and subterfuge and espionage to take place. The fact that these delegates are protected from having their briefcases and luggage searched is ridiculous. That is just absolutely bonkers. But what it tells you is, I think what we're really seeing and what we have to bear in mind is that it's not a case of communists against capitalists. It's really not. Like he was saying, why would a country do this? Why would a country accept this? Well, it's because the people running both sides are making it so. Like he says, the international financiers, they're the ones pulling the strings. They're the ones who rolled out and financed the Bolshevik Revolution, and then tested that system out, fine-tuned it a little bit, and then supported the people who had the long-term plans to bring that system to other countries and spread it to other places, to eventually spread it everywhere, right? So that there becomes this top-down control of everything, which is the end goal of communism and international socialism. So I think you start to see the picture here with Ed Griffin's book, with it being written 10 years before this. I didn't think he really included that international financiers aspect of this story. So Gary Allen coming along and putting that massive missing piece of the puzzle in to name those banks and those people who were involved in the Paris 1919 peace accords, the founding of the League of Nations, that failing, the requirement of another world war, the expectation of a new United Nations, and the money, because all this stuff always needs money, and money is always being used to destabilize countries, to prop up different regimes and different dictators and different groups who are doing the bidding of these financiers, because otherwise, that's what you do, isn't it? You do the thing that the person who's paying you wants you to do. That's largely how the world works, and pretty much all of us are fall into that behavior pattern at some point or another. So I think that was a really excellent article, and I would definitely recommend people to kind of get hold of that electronic copy. And I would have to go and read through it again, because it's got so many names and quotes in there. But yeah, why? How can a peace organization fail so spectacularly at bringing about peace, and yet countries are still joining it? Countries are still sending it money and allowing UNESCO and UNICEF to operate in their countries. There's something else going on, right? When the thing doesn't do what it says it does, and yet it still gets support, and it still grows and expands and still accrues power and influence, then there's something else going on. The overt, let's say the exoteric reason for that organization's existence is not correct, and there's an esoteric, underlying, hidden or occult reason for that organization to exist. And I think Gary Allen's article that we just read there makes that case very well, very clearly. Okay. My throat is absolutely ripped up at this point, so I'm going to give it a rest for now. I can usually do a full 3 hours without this happening, but for some reason my stamina's not what it should be today. So thank you for hanging in there with me for that reading. We'll have to come back. I'm going to say tentatively pencil in Thursday, but I'll just clear that and make sure I'll announce it in my Telegram. So if you're not in my Telegram group, then consider joining up there, but it'll also go onto Instagram and Twitter. So you can follow there and get the announcements when I do go live. Please consider joining the mailing list if you haven't already. You can shoot me an email, autonomoususername@gmail.com. Then we can stay in contact. And you get another video in this series. I'll have to call it part 10.5 or something like that, because this was supposed to be the last one, but we've still got a bit more to get through. So thank you for hanging in with me and bearing with my coughing and slurping and inexpert muting and my raspy voice. I feel like it's quite raspy at this point. So I'll sign off and hope you're all doing well, staying positive and busy, focusing on the good and helping each other, yourselves, and getting away from just the constant onslaught of craziness that is the internet these days. Because I'm doing pretty good at detoxing from that stuff at the minute. I tend to pretty much follow a handful of groups, and then the reading that we do on this channel forms the bulk of my learning about and focus on the kind of bigger picture of what's going on. So I think that's a good way to do it. Make sure you've got your needs met and that you are safe and warm and you've got some food in your belly, and then you've got people around you who you can take care of and look after and focus on during these wild, crazy, turbulent times as we watch the unfolding of the international communist conspiracy backed by the craziest financiers who have probably ever existed. I don't know. They've probably always been this crazy, haven't they? All right, I'm going to leave it there. Good night, everybody. Take care of yourselves and each other. I will see you on the next one. I will announce it sometime soon, and we will finish this. All right. Take care, and God bless.